Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 23 of Life Lessons and Combat Sports. I'm your host, Eric Hamidi, here to give you another regaling tale within the realm of combat sports while also attaching an important life lesson to it. So, something I feel like I need to point out about my podcast is that the way episodes come about is really just dependent on whatever I feel like talking about on a given day for a particular episode. Because my podcast is constructed in a way where there isn't a hard set agenda or rules or a list that I have to follow, it really just comes down to here's the thing that I feel like talking about and that I feel like I am able to talk about on said given day when I hit the record button. With that means that not every episode I do is always relevant to current events or is relevant to the things that are currently ongoing within the realm of combat sports. But to be honest, that's kind of a style I really enjoy, and I feel like it's really good for my well-being and maintaining a healthy work-life balance and all that stuff. So yeah, it's not always related to what's going on in the now. However, this episode is in fact one of those instances where the topic I talk about is something that's happening in real time, because on Saturday is an upcoming UFC card. And what I'm interested about with this podcast is that it also occurred to me that it's been a while since I've actually talked about a combat sport. What with my last two episodes, they were about professional wrestling and all that, so it's cool to get back to an actual combat sport, and here it'll be mixed martial arts. So the UFC has their event on Saturday. Now, there's a couple reasons why this event that's happening on Saturday is significant or why it's a big deal, and it comes down to two reasons. One is that it is the first UFC event as part of their new media rights deal with Paramount. So what ended up happening was that at the end of 2025, there was an announcement that the UFC had reached an agreement with Paramount to stream their events on Paramount Plus and CBS. So it was a multi-year deal, billion-dollar-year deal and all that stuff. So it's quite significant. And this is the first event that's part of it, but more so, the event that's happening on Saturday is UFC 324. Now, in the past, under every other media rights deal that they've had, these numbered events would air on pay-per-view. The way it is now is that if you have Paramount Plus, then you have access to all the pay-per-view events. There's no longer that condition of, oh, you have to pay the subscription fee for the streaming service and the fee for pay-per-view. It's all just in one. You're removing that paywall there. And that's a stark contrast to how the UFC has done their business up till this point, because under every other media rights deal, they always did pay-per-views for these numbered events. And for quite a long time, when the UFC first started in 1993, all they did were pay-per-views. It wasn't until the mid-2000s that they started including fight nights that would air on cable or network television. So that's a big deal with that. It'll be interesting to see how these cards are constructed, because if they are eliminating that paywall as far as pay-per-view goes, then I don't know. It raises the question as far as how are they going to construct the cards, who's going to fight on it, how many people are going to watch, how much effort's going to be put into it, which kind of deals with quality. So it's something that'll be interesting to see that I guess will only really reveal itself as time goes on. So that's the big thing about this upcoming deal, or about this coming event. But also another thing that's significant about it is the fact that it's the UFC's first event since their extended winter break. So what they've been doing over the last several years is that when mid-December hits, they take a month off before resuming events again. However, this time around, they took an even longer break. So instead of 4 weeks, they took 6 weeks off. And to be honest, it was kind of amusing or interesting or concerning or whatever word you want to use to see people online worried about this extended break, because I saw a lot of people being all like, what am I going to do during this time off? Or how am I going to go 6 weeks without watching UFC? Or just like, that seems like such a long time from now. But I don't know, my stance the last few years, and then even more so this year, is just like, guys, you'll be fine. You'll live. But I guess now we're at that point where you won't have to worry about that anymore, because it's fight week and UFC 324 is upon us. So what I'm going to talk about in this episode is the main event and the kind of life lesson I've been able to extract from the situation with that card. So UFC 324 is being headlined by Paddy Pimblett versus Justin Gaethje for the Interim UFC Lightweight Championship. Now, the reason why there is an interim champion is because the actual champion of the division, Ilia Topuria, he is going through some problems as far as personal issues and going through a divorce and all that stuff. That's making him unavailable to fight for the first part of 2026. So in June, he fought against Charles Oliveira for the vacant UFC Lightweight Championship after the previous champion, Islam Makhachev, vacated the belt and left the division to move up a weight class. So he was the lightweight champion, where the weight limit for that is 155 pounds. Islam vacated and moved up to welterweight, which the weight limit for that is 170 pounds. And he did that so that he could compete for that title, necessitating this vacant title fight. And what's kind of interesting is that I predicted Charles Oliveira to win that fight, but then Ilia ended up winning and knocking him out. So I don't know, it's an interesting thing with my predictions when it comes to MMA. It almost seems like there's no middle ground with it. It's either I'm horribly wrong or I am spot on right, to the point where you would think I'm like Nostradamus or something like that. But that particular event is one of those I was horribly wrong predictions. So Ilia won the belt at that moment, but then he ended up having the problems that I mentioned, which necessitated this interim title fight. Now, the whole point of an interim championship is to try to keep the division moving, keep the line of contenders in a particular division moving, and to give those fighters in that weight class something to fight for. There's a prize at the end of the tunnel and all that stuff. So that is really why an interim title at its core, or ideally, is all about. And the only reason I'm saying that is because the whole concept of crowning interim champions, at least in the UFC, has become muddied over the years. Because in the past, they would crown an interim champion when there was some type of problem going on with the actual title holder or the undisputed title holder that either was out of their control, or there was no clear-cut resolution, or there wasn't a definitive timetable for when they would return. So, as an example, back in 2004, you had Frank Mir, who was the UFC heavyweight champion. He ended up getting into a motorcycle accident that injured him and was going to put him out of commission for a certain amount of time. Now, a motorcycle accident, that's a freak occurrence, and it's something that is outside of their control and all that stuff, or wasn't his fault. So the UFC, for whatever reason, or just they came to the conclusion that they didn't feel like it was appropriate to relieve him of said championship. So what the UFC did in the meantime was that they made an interim heavyweight title fight for February 2005 between Tim Sylvia and Andrei Arlovski. So Andre ended up winning that fight, so he was the interim heavyweight champion while they were figuring out what was happening with Frank Mir. And ideally, what would have happened was that once Frank Mir healed from his injuries from that accident, he would have came back and he would have fought Andrei Arlovski to unify the actual heavyweight title and the interim heavyweight title. However, what ended up happening was that Frank couldn't recover and come back to action in a timely manner, so they decided to strip Frank Mir of the heavyweight title and promoted Andrei Arlovski to undisputed heavyweight champion. But that is something that an interim championship is also supposed to do, is give some type of guarantee that when the actual title holder of a division comes back, then you have a unification bout. However, over the last several years, this is coming back to the whole interim title thing has become muddied over the years, is the fact that even if somebody does win the interim championship in the UFC for a particular weight class, there's no guarantee that they actually get a unification bout. And that is a component or a byproduct of the problem of how these interim championships come to be in the first place. Because what will happen is that because UFC has so many events, if a champion of a particular division is unavailable for whatever reason, then, and like unavailable not because they're injured, but because, hey, we have this event in this town that we need to do, but this person feels like they can't have a successful training camp to get ready in time for it, oh, then we'll make an interim title fight because they feel like they can't put on these numbered events in particular. They can't have these numbered events go on without some type of title fight. So there's a lot of instances where interim championships come up unnecessarily and out of thin air and all that stuff. So that's one of the reasons why interim titles have kind of become very, let's just say there's not a whole lot of credibility behind those. And when we're on the topic of credibility, it's sort of adding on to another problem that this particular main event is having, in the sense of you have Justin Gaethje and Paddy Pimblett, both of which are ranked number 4 and number 5 in the lightweight division. So maybe you might be thinking, if you're watching this and you're not familiar with MMA or the UFC and all that stuff, that's why I'm going into detail explaining some of this stuff. And then also, if you're not familiar with it, you may be wondering, well, who's the number 1 ranked fighter of a given division, and why isn't he or she fighting? So UFC has rankings for all of their weight classes. They'll have the champion that's at top, and then they'll have the contenders from 1 to 15 in that list. So for the lightweight division, the number 1 ranked fighter is Arman Tsarukyan. So he plays a role in all of this whole UFC 324 storyline, because back in April of 2024, he had a fight against Charles Oliveira at UFC 300, which I was able to attend that event live. So it was it was fun to be able to just watch that event as a whole live, but then also be able to see that in person. So that was a cool experience to have. So that fight, it was going to determine who was going to be the number 1 contender for the UFC Lightweight Championship. And what's kind of funny about that is that I was texting a friend of mine back and forth. Basically, we were giving our predictions for that. He predicted Arman would win. I was picking Charles Oliveira. So we were texting each other back and forth, and he was saying things like, oh, we're going to smash your boy. And I was like saying, okay, we'll see what happens. And, the fight plays out, and ultimately Arman wins. So it's kind of interesting how that's another instance, or, the predecessor to last June, where I predicted Charles Oliveira to win, but he didn't. So I don't know. It was my luck for those particular fights, and I don't know. Props to my friend for calling it. If he's watching this, he knows who he is. So that basically set Arman up for a lightweight title fight. However, there was a delay in that fight actually materializing because Arman got into some type of altercation with a fan, which put him out of commission for a little bit. But eventually all these things are sorted out, and Arman is booked for a lightweight title fight against Islam Makhachev as the main event for UFC 311 in January of last year in my backyard of LA, actually. So that match was set, but then what ended up happening was the day before, Arman had to pull out of the fight due to hurting his back and all that stuff. So the UFC had to put together a last-minute main event, which they were able to do. Now, some of that is just based on the type of control that the UFC has over the MMA industry as a whole, but also the control that they have over the fighters, and that's due to various reasons. Some of that being the fighters' fault, kind of like what I talked about in my Ali Act episodes or whatever. But they were able to pull it together they were able to pull it off in a way that maybe other fighting or combat sports promotions wouldn't be able to. So a new main event for UFC 311 was set. Islam Makhachev versus Renato Moicano. Islam ends up winning that fight. A few months after that, he vacates the championship, which led into the series of events that I've talked about up to this point. Now, what's crazy is that June title fight between Ilya and Charles, Arman actually weighed in as the backup fighter. And what I mean by that, once again, this is in case anyone who's watching it doesn't understand or doesn't know, is that if for whatever reason Ilya or Charles couldn't make it to the fight, then Arman, he weighed in at 155 pounds, which for title fights you have to weigh in on the actual weight limit. So you can't be, for instance, 156, you have to be 155 for lightweight title fights. So Arman did that, so if they needed him, he was going to jump in, but ultimately that wasn't needed. So a few months after that, Arman has a fight against Dan Hooker, and he wins that one. Leading up to that Dan Hooker fight back in November, Dana was talking to the press or the media saying that if Arman won, then he would have gotten a lightweight title fight. However, that's not happening. And as I've already mentioned, we got Paddy versus Justin on Saturday. Now, it would be one thing if Arman was injured and he couldn't compete. Then from there, you would just go down the list of contenders in your rankings and go with the highest ranking individual who's available. But the thing is that Arman is not injured. He can fight. He is able to. But yet, he's not booked in this title fight. And maybe you might be wondering, why is that? Well, it's highly believed that there is animosity between the UFC and Arman Tsarukyan for pulling out of UFC 311 last year. Now, I don't know why exactly UFC 311 was such a big deal, or what made that event such a big deal to the point that the management at UFC would be so upset about Arman pulling out. Because, I mean, they've had situations like, for instance, UFC 200 back in July of 2016. Jon Jones pulls out of the main event 3 days before and all that stuff. And how many how many light heavyweight title shots and just title shots in general did Jon Jones get after that? Now, of course, people will say there's the name value of Jon Jones that Arman Tsarukyan doesn't have, but it doesn't take away from the hypocrisy and all that stuff. But basically, that is the situation that Arman is in, where it's almost like he's being punished for that. Although it's weird because, like, there were some interviews where it was almost like Dana was giving contradictory information or giving contradictory statements as far as, oh, well, he's not in our bad graces, or we're cool with him, or just we're not retaliating against him, but then within the same statement or whatever, he's saying, oh, well, he knows what he did and he needs to work his way up and all that stuff. So it's just kind of like, well, is he in trouble or not? But at this point, it's believed that the UFC brass is not happy with the fact that Arman pulled out, so they are refusing to book him in a title fight, which from a meritocracy standpoint and under different kinds of circumstances where perhaps there is a rankings, there's a different entity that ranks fighters, or your organization operated like the NBA does, where the highest ranking teams move on to an opportunity to compete for the championship, you would think like, oh, that would have to happen. You would have to book Arman Tsarukyan, and maybe if some of those protections were in place, then the UFC would have to abide by that. But that's not the model that they operate under. They operate under the matchmaker model. So it really just all depends on what they feel like doing at a given time for a particular fight. And that leads into the problems between the two different approaches for matchmaking when it comes to mixed martial arts. So you have what the UFC does as far as the matchmaker model, where they can basically book their own matches and they don't always have to follow the criteria of how to book matches. So for instance, they're not bound by, oh, well, we make fights with the highest ranked individuals who are available. It's like, oh, well, we could do that, but if there are some personal feelings involved, then there's nothing stopping them from operating under that. So that, I mean, like, that creates problems just because if you don't have the highest ranked fighters available competing for a championship, then it makes the championship less credible. In my opinion, it sort of calls into question, okay, is this champion legit? Is the matchmaking structure legitimate? Is the process of becoming the best fighter legitimate? Also, it calls into question of, okay, well, if Paddy, Pimblett, and Justin Gaethje are fighting, but they're ranked number 4 and number 5, then how do we know those guys are truly the best fighters of that division? Or just how do we know that the person who has the championship is actually deserving of that distinction as the best fighter of that weight class? To me, it just, I don't know, it just really makes you poke holes or just like think that something's wrong or not right, or just this person is not actually the best when you don't have the highest ranked fighters actually fighting each other, which once again, Arman is able to compete, but he's at the mercy of the reasons that I just described. But the other thing, like the other extreme, would be what some other organizations have done in the past, for instance, like a Bellator or a PFL, where they operated strictly under a tournament format. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory, even if you're not a sports fan, is that you have a list of competitors or teams in tournaments. They're in brackets. If you win, you move on to the next round and you face the winner of whoever's in your bracket. So it's pretty straightforward, and that eliminates the problems as far as undeserving title shots or people who are coming off of a lot of losses getting title fights or championship opportunities and all that other stuff. But the thing is that while that solves one problem, it leads into another problem, because you restrict yourself. If you operate under like that tournament or season format, then you restrict yourself to that system. So you kind of remove yourself from the ability to book the most marketable or profit. Like basically, you're unable to book the fights that will make the most amount of money, which if you're a fight promotion, that's part of your responsibility, is that you need to put on fights that people are willing to pay to see. But if you operate under a tournament format, and fighter C wins instead of fighter B, and fighter B has a lot of animosity with fighter A, which would create a big storyline that could draw people in, well, unfortunately, with said tournament format, you're stuck with fighter A versus fighter C, which maybe it will do well, but not as well as another type of matchup. And I've seen MMA organizations sort of struggle with this and have to finagle their way out of it and all that stuff. So that is a problem. That is the other side of the extreme. And it's kind of interesting how I'm using the word extreme, considering my last episode I was talking about extreme championship wrestling or whatever. But those are the two issues where it just, if you lean one way or the other, it causes this problem. So the thing that I've discovered as an MMA fan over the last few years is that, to me, the best approach is to take a more balanced approach, where you look at what fights or what fighters are available and you have a balance between this is the person who's most deserving and then this is the most marketable matchup for us. I think that's the route to go, because you need to have some type of access to the pros of both systems. You need to be able to look at a particular matchup or possible matchup and think, hey, we can book this because from a finance standpoint, it's going to do very well. But at the same time, it's still legitimate. It's not a fighter who's coming off of like 3 losses in a row and all that stuff, and we're booking him in a title fight or her in a title fight, and that way you keep the integrity of the sport. You keep it, I mean, to me, by doing that, you have some type of prestige that is still maintained, and that really that's what competitive sports should be. So while a balanced approach is better, in my opinion, I want to make it clear that this isn't like a call to action, because I know ultimately the people who are in management are the only ones who can really make this decision and take these kinds of actions, and they're not going to listen to me or anything like that. So it's not like I'm saying that as, oh, hey, everybody, like, let's try to make this happen. No, the main point for this episode is to bestow and share with y'all something that you can take in your own personal everyday life. I mean, what I'm saying is not revelatory. I'm sure it's something that you haven't heard before, but I think it bears getting out there to the masses, or getting it out there to anyone who's interested or is watching or whatever, is that you need to have balance in your own life. And that can manifest in a lot of different ways. I mean, it could manifest in having a work-life balance. It could manifest in, I guess, conflict resolution. What I mean by those things in particular is, for instance, sometimes I've had situations where I've had job offers, and these job offers, or I saw a job opening that was a little bit more related to my field or my experience, or kind of like my long-term career goals, but it paid less than the job I'm at or was at currently. Now, if there's a job that is more aligned with what I want to do, but it pays a little less, then I'd be willing to do it, because if it's for a company or providing a service that I really believe in, then I would want to be part of that. And as long as the money isn't that much lower than what I'm earning now, then it's something I would consider. Now, if I was in a situation where like this job that was more aligned with what I want to do, if there was like a 50% or 60% decrease in pay, then that might be a little bit more of a stopping point for me, and that may be more of a hurdle, or that just may be something that makes me not pursue this job. But barring that, that's a way that balance can play out. And then another way for me, and this is kind of something that's become a little important for me as the years, like as I've gotten older and just as I've lived more life, is, for instance, having a balanced approach when someone is critiquing you. I think having a balanced approach can be really beneficial there, because once again, let's go into like the 2 different extremes here. If you go with the extreme, if you don't have a balanced approach to that, if you take the extreme of, oh, well, this person has no case whatsoever, or they're completely wrong and I'm right and all this other stuff, then you can lose out on opportunities for a stronger connection or for chances to improve yourself. I mean, this kind of goes in line with whenever someone is giving you a critique or giving you constructive criticism on something that you did, or just something that was said, or whatever it is that you take away your opportunity to improve and learn or develop and make your life even better by taking on that more ignorant sort of approach. However, on the flip side of that, if you go too far into the other extreme where you just, for instance, if someone is criticizing your work, if there's really no legitimate claim to that, then you may be inclined to just believe them and just get sucked into negativity or falsehoods or all this other stuff. I mean, if someone is just criticizing you just to be negative, but you heed that thinking that it's serious, then, I mean, I don't know, that could be so much. I mean, that could manifest itself in a way that, as simply put, you're a singer, but someone says, oh, you're terrible at singing when you're actually really good at singing, then you may stop singing because this person said you were no good at it, when in reality that person had no idea what they were talking about. So that's an example of two kinds of extremes that can happen. And to me, if you were to go down that route of thinking that this person who's criticizing you has a legitimate claim when they're not, I mean, I don't know. I feel like it's kind of related to the whole, if you don't stand for something, then you'll fall for anything. I think it's important to have certain standards or beliefs for yourself, or have things that you personally believe in and stand for. So then that way that can guide you through said improvement process as effectively as possible. To me, that's a big thing. And to me, I feel as though, I don't know, it's like I said, it would be easy to just not even consider the other person's perspective when there's some type of disagreement. But if you do, then that can open the door for improvement, and then maintaining what kind of connections that you have with individuals and all that stuff. To me, having a balance with anything will either lead to the best outcome possible, or it gives you the opportunity to get the best outcome possible. And I don't know, I feel like that's a healthier way or a happier way to live life, just because there is no closing yourself off to the good things of life if you remain open and all that stuff. With regards to the sports world, I mean, in particular with this episode, mixed martial arts, if they took a more balanced approach with their title fight, then Arman would be one of the competitors in this fight, in this headliner that's happening on Saturday. And I don't know, I'm kind of thinking about this stuff in the moment where, one, it would make things right as far as, okay, one of the people who should be in this slot is in fact in this slot. So now we know the best is fighting the best. But also, if Paddy or Justin were to defeat Arman, then that would boost up their credibility, or that would boost up their name and their skill set, because you would think, oh crap, they beat Arman, so that's a big deal. And the best way I can put this is an example from a different sport, where for the 2015-2016 season, Kobe Bryant, he announced that that was going to be his last season. So whenever the Lakers had their last game, that would be it for Kobe's career. Now, the Lakers didn't do too well that season, and they weren't one of the 8 teams who qualified for the playoffs. So when April of 2016 rolled around, whatever date that was going to be the Lakers' last game of the season. So that was going to be Kobe's last game of the season. They're not going to the playoffs, so it's not like there's anything after that. Now, if the NBA operated the same way that UFC did, then despite what the Lakers' record was, they would look at the storyline of Kobe Bryant's last game and decide, hey, we're going to put the Lakers in the playoffs or the NBA Finals against whichever team from the East Coast. And that would call into question, to me, that would cause a lot of outrage, because you would just look at that and you think, what the hell? Like, you have the Lakers in the finals, and you're doing that with the record that they have, and they're going up against whoever the best team on the East Conference is. it wouldn't sit well. It wouldn't make sense. There would be so much criticism about that, and it would be legitimate. And I don't think that's too ridiculous of a comparison to make, just given the fact that in 2016, Dan Henderson, who was lower down on the rankings in the middleweight division, ended up getting a middleweight title fight against then champion Michael Bisping, and that was all done because it was Dan Henderson's last fight, and they had fought each other back in 2009 and all that other stuff. So they just went ahead and went with it. And here the storyline would have been something. You have Kobe Bryant, one of the best basketball players ever, trying to win one more title and all that stuff. But under the NBA's format, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. But if they operated under a different model, similar to UFC, being a matchmaker, then that would have happened. So I think that's a way to give an idea of how ridiculous the whole matchmaking can be, but at the same time, a tournament structure can be very problematic within a sport like mixed martial arts. So that's why you need to have balance. And I don't know, it's kind of crazy how I'm able to draw these conclusions and apply them to the bigger picture of life based on what happens in combat sports. But hey, that's the whole point of this podcast. With that, I feel like I have talked enough and given you enough things to think about. So I will just say that if you are going to watch the fights on Saturday, I hope you enjoy them. But if you're not, thank you for taking the time to listen to my episode. Let me know what you guys think about it in the comments section below. Be sure to like, share, subscribe to my videos, and also check me out on social media. I'm on Instagram, Life and Combat Sports, and then I'm also on Twitter at LCombatSports. All right, everyone. I'll catch you on the next one. See ya.